The Archer AX73 is one of the first AX5400 routers developed by TP-Link, and yes, we do currently have 3 other options available from the same manufacturer, but it's the cheapest one available, so it gained a bit more attention. The AX73 seems to be in the same class with the Asus RT AX82U, which has proven to be a fairly reliable router, both sharing the same SoC and Wi-Fi chips, but while the hardware is extremely important, the software and user experience have at least an equal value. And there's also something that TP-Link has done that caught my eye, and it's about the decision to add the Home Shield package to the AX73 while keeping the Home Care out. And the Home Care package was provided by Trend Micro, and it included quality of system, parental control, and even an antivirus. So hopefully TP-Link didn't take the same road as Netgear and removed important features for the sake of re-adding them later with a subscription. In any case, the TP-Link AX73 does come with the expected Wi-Fi 6 features, such as OFDMA, the 1024 QAM modulation and the 160 MHz channel bandwidth, so let's put it to the test and see how well it fares when compared to its main competitors. You rarely get a TP-Link router with a plain look, and the AX73 is one of those devices where the manufacturer said yes to pretty much every idea that came from the design team. And the end result is a rectangular plastic case with a large glossy area at the top, surrounded by a very unique pattern that covers almost the entire upper section of the router. The pattern resembles some sort of textile braiding, and there are multiple cutouts to let the air flow through. The bottom part of the router is covered by the same type of pattern, and these small but numerous ventilation holes do help quite a bit with keeping the internal temperature in check. There are also 4 silicone feet to keep the router in place, and there are a couple of holes to help you mount the device on the wall. It's also worth mentioning that the AX73 does have 6 antennas, 4 positioned on the rear side and 2 on the left and right side of the device. And no, they're not detachable. TP-Link has kept the 7 LEDs on the front of the AX73, and while they're quite discreet, you do get the option to turn them off if the light bothers you during the night. On the rear side of the TP-Link AX73 there are 4 buttons, one for turning off or on the LEDs, one for enabling the WPS process, one for turning off or on the Wi-Fi, and the last one is the recessed reset button. Further to the right there are 4 LAN ports, all gigabit, 1 WAN port, also gigabit, and a power button as well as a power connector. On the right side of the AX73 there's a single USB 3.0 port for adding a printer or an external storage device. As I mentioned before, TP-Link was very generous on adding lots of ventilation holes, so even if the router relies on passive cooling, it's still enough to keep the temperature in check. I use a smartphone equipped with a thermal camera, and as you can see there are some warm spots where the heat is pushed outside the case, but there doesn't seem to be any sign that the device may overheat. I have already opened the TP-Link AX73 in a different video, and you can check the full teardown process if you want. Otherwise, I have included the highlights in this video so you can see the main components here as well. I should mention that it's fairly easy to open the router, so it shouldn't be too difficult to access the PCB and blow away any accumulated dust. Just like the Netgear AX50, the TP-Link AX73 is a Wi-Fi 6 router that hasn't completely adhered to the draft stage 3.0. But there is a fundamental difference between it and the Netgear router, and that's the support for the WAN mesh, which similarly to the AI mesh, it can create a mesh network using multiple types of TP-Link routers. Obviously, the Asus AI mesh is far more vast than the WAN mesh in terms of model compatibility, but it's still a step in the right direction. Besides the mesh capabilities, the TP-Link Archer AX73 does come with a highlighted feature from the Wi-Fi 6 standard, the OFDMA. This feature splits the channel bandwidth into multiple resource units that can vary in size, and they can be allocated for communicating with multiple client devices at the same time. Doing so, you get a better handling of smaller data packets and far less interference. MoMIMO is also supported and should help handling multiple client devices at the same time, without needing to rely on the round-robin technique. But the client device compatibility is still an issue even today. The same remains true for the beamforming and the 160 MHz channel bandwidth. If you don't have compatible clients, the throughput will not differ that much from what you would get from using Wi-Fi 5 routers. Following the saga of testing the wireless routers in a better way than just relying on single client tests, which are the easy way out for most publications, I decided to put the TP-Link AX73 through the hurdles of multi-client tests. And yes, the principle is the same as before. We connect 5 client devices to a server computer and then simulate various types of traffic. At the moment it's 4K and 1080p streaming, web browsing, downloading, and voice over IP. I relied on the open source tools developed by Mr. Jim Salter, NetBurn, which creates the traffic simulations, and the NetHydra, which runs multiple instances of NetBurn on the set client devices. I know that a lot of you will say that these tests are not exactly purely objective, and yes, the results will differ depending on the amount of interference, the location, and the type of client devices. Sure, there are better multi-client tests out there, such as the Octopal, but that will have an impact on the wallet, and not many professionals bother with non-enterprise wireless networking devices since the cost is just too high. The client devices that I chose are not from the same Wi-Fi standard. One is Wi-Fi 6E, 2 are Wi-Fi 6, and 2 are Wi-Fi 5. While there is a financial reason for the Wi-Fi standard mismatch, laptops and PCs cost money, understand that we should be able to better simulate a home or office network when the client devices are more diverse. As for the server computer, these are its specifications. It's also worth mentioning that I try to keep the same distance between the client devices and the server, same as when testing the other wireless routers, but since distance means little, I decided to share the attenuation that was detected at the client level. The first type of multi-client test is the simulation of 1080p traffic on all client devices at the same time, and ideally, the latency should remain underneath 50 milliseconds or even lower in order to maintain a fairly decent streaming experience. We can see from the graphic that 2 client devices remained underneath 100 milliseconds pretty much for the entire duration of the test, but a couple of clients, one Wi-Fi 6 Lenovo laptop and the Wi-Fi 6 PC, did experience a latency spike, even though for about 5% of the time. Still, most did get close to 100 milliseconds and even above it, indicating that it is possible to experience some buffering at the client level. I also checked whether the clients managed to reach the 5 megabits per second limit that was set by me, and surprisingly, not all did. The worst offender remains one of the Wi-Fi 6 laptops, while the best performers were the 2 Wi-Fi 5 client devices. Moving forward, I ran the same multi-client test, but with a limit set to 25 megabits per second. And as expected, the performance was a bit worse. We can see that the 2 Wi-Fi 5 client devices managed to remain below 150 milliseconds for the most part, the ZimaBoard 832 going above it for 1% of the cases, while the MacBook Pro seeing spikes for 5% of the time. The worst offender is the Wi-Fi 6E client, which is pretty much unusable, while the 2 Wi-Fi 6 client devices will experience buffering more often. Then again, there was no point at which the latency was below 50 milliseconds on any client device, so the simultaneous 4K streaming test is not really a success. Are the continuous 1080p streaming simulations actually realistic? Depending on the application, they can be surprisingly accurate, while the simulated web browsing will most likely not be as intense in real life. A website is composed of multiple resources, images, text, videos, which are then loaded as fast as possible, and we try to emulate that by running 12 concurrent 128 kilobytes of data for each client device. I have also injected 500 milliseconds of jitter for some semblance of realism. While running 1080p traffic alongside intense browsing on all 5 client devices at the same time, we see that the ZimaBoard goes above 100 milliseconds pretty much all of the time. And I suppose it makes sense considering that it is the farthest client device. The other clients did better, but the Wi-Fi 6E client device experienced some latency spikes for about 1% of the time. As for the continuous intense browsing, I set the limit to 1.5 seconds, and it's where the experience would become unbearable and the user would have to reload the page. The only client device that went past that limit is the Wi-Fi 6E client, but it's worth mentioning that a single client, one Wi-Fi 6E laptop, was the only one to maintain a fairly low latency. The rest were pretty much at the limit. While simulating 4K streaming and intense web browsing at the same time on all client devices, we can see that the latency goes above 100 milliseconds on all clients pretty much immediately, with only the MacBook Pro remaining below it for 75% of the time. The Wi-Fi 6E computer delivered a close to unusable performance for the entire duration of the test. Of course, these results focus only on the 4K streaming aspect. What about the intense web browsing? All managed to remain below the 1.5 seconds limit, but then again 3 of them went very close to this limit. I have also included download traffic into the test since there were some complaints that the bandwidth just wasn't stressed enough, and perhaps I went a bit overboard. Or maybe not. I am awaiting feedback on the matter. So I have decided to download 10 megabytes files continuously on 2 client devices for now, while 2 other clients were struggling to stream 4K videos at the same time with a 35 megabits per second max limit, and another one fighting with all its might to navigate the web. The latency for the 2 clients that had the simulated download traffic shot straight to the moon and stood there for the entire duration of the test. The client that ran the intense browsing did decently well considering the situation, so the user can navigate the web, while one of the 2 clients with the 4K streaming traffic managed to remain underneath 1 second for most of the time. Is that good? Not really, unless you don't mind constant buffering, but it is better than the client that went close to 8 seconds. Next, I limited the 10 megabytes downloading to a single client, while the others ran 2 simultaneous 4K streaming simulations and 2 intense browsing simulations. Again, regardless of the type of client, the downloading latency shots up high, but I suppose it is worth mentioning that it averaged about 393 megabits per second. The 2 4K streaming clients went above 300 milliseconds for pretty much the entire time, which is far from ideal, while the 2 intense browsing clients tried fairly well, although one shows some signs of fatigue for about 1% of the time. Moving forward, I limited the selection of the clients to only 3, one for 4K streaming, one for continuous 10 megabytes file downloading, and one for intense browsing. And things did get better. We got between 50 and 70 milliseconds for up to 90% of the time, but the latency did go above the acceptable limit for the rest of 10%. The 4K streaming latency remained below 100 milliseconds for pretty much the entire duration of the test, and while I won't deny that I would have liked values below 50 milliseconds, it's still a better performance than before. As for the intense browsing, it's a decent latency as well. I also had to add voice over IP, but I kept the 3 client configuration. The downloading client, despite having to move only 1 megabytes files this time, it still went to the moon, while the intense browsing was somewhat more contained. The voice over IP latency remained below 100 milliseconds for most of the time, with some spikes above it for about 1% of the time. Is this good? As I said before, ideally it should stay below 30 milliseconds and even lower, but a lot of people argue that even 150 milliseconds is acceptable performance. Lastly, I had to run the 10 megabytes file downloading traffic simulation on all 5 client devices to see if I managed to reach the max bandwidth and perhaps even collapse the entire network. The results you can see for yourself. They're all over the place, with the Wi-Fi 6E client staying below 1 second for the entire time, the others going to unreasonable levels. Not that 500 milliseconds is good performance, mind you. The good news is that the network did not collapse, and I did see a total average throughput of 457.2 megabits per second. So I don't think I maxed the bandwidth, although the clients were given the freedom to do so. Moving on to the single client tests, I relied on a client device equipped with an AX200 Wi-Fi adapter and on a server device that's connected directly to the router via an Ethernet cable. I have also used a client equipped with a Wi-Fi 5 Intel 8265 adapter and an old Pixel 2 XL smartphone, also Wi-Fi 5. The distance is an easily understandable metric, but not a very reliable one due to the impossibility to reproduce the results outside my own home or lab. So I decided to also take the signal attenuation into account. This way you can see the same throughput in your own home as long as the attenuation is the same. It's worth mentioning that I have retested the TP-Link AX73 last year, and I have retested it again to include a broader coverage on more client devices. And I have seen an improvement downstream over the last time I tested the wireless router, but it's also worth mentioning that I did not take attenuation into account back then, so these results are both fresh and easier to reproduce. I have also included some longer-term throughput tests using both the 80 MHz and the 160 MHz channel bandwidth. Lastly, I also decided to show where the TP-Link AX73 currently stands in comparison with other wireless routers, especially after the retest and the firmware update. After the firmware update and the change in my location, since I first tested the AX73 about 3 years ago, the performance on the 2.4 GHz network seems to be better. And while the throughput is nothing impressive, the range is far improved, so we get to see good numbers even at 70 feet and beyond. The LAN-to-LAN performance was decent, with the average upstream throughput being 950 megabits per second, and the average downstream throughput was 926 megabits per second. Since the AX73 has a USB port, I connected a SanDisk Extreme external SSD, and I moved around a multimedia folder of about 3.5 GB. This way I saw an average read speed of 89.1 megabytes per second, and an average write speed of about 55 megabytes per second. Now let's check the power consumption of the TP-Link AX73. I used a smart relay and checked the recorded values from the dedicated app. I set up the router using the app, and after that I gained access to the mobile app interface. It has changed quite a bit over the last 3 years, the layout now being somewhat similar to the ASUS app, but I suppose only structurally. The main page is the network, where you can see the status of the device, see all the clients that are connected, and yes, you can tap on any of them to configure the quality of service or simply add it to the parental control profile. You can also see regular reports and even access the guest network. The home shield is a bit less intrusive than it was years ago, and it's now a part of the security tab, which does resemble the inside section from the ASUS routers. But if you want to gain access to the advanced features from the Home Shield Security Plus, you need to pay for a subscription. If you do so, you do get to use the web protection, their IPS, the IoT protection and more. But the good news is that they did not tamper with the parental controls. Well, kind of, as we'll see in a minute. And yes, it's a separate tab called Family, which will allow you to create profiles and apply them onto devices. There's also content filtering, the possibility to block certain websites, and so basic scheduling. This is what you get by default, but the Home Shield adds a bit more to the parental controls with its advanced package, displaying detailed statistics about which websites, apps and services have been accessed by a specific device. Additionally, you get to block or reward that device, see the total time spent online, and you can check a monthly or weekly report on both the parental controls and antivirus. The free version lacks the advertised malicious content filtering, the intrusion prevention system, and the DDoS protection, something that was a part of the home care and came at no additional cost. The last section of interest is the More window, where you get to set up the wireless network with only the SSID and the passkey, check the one mesh status, configure the guest network, the notifications, the operation mode, update the firmware and more. There is also an advanced settings area which only lets you set up the IPTV VLAN. It supports bridge and ICP profile, and you can set the mode for each LAN port. Overall, it's a decent mobile application with more features than Netgear but less than ASUS. As for the web-based interface, TP-Link has changed it a bit, and it now looks very different than what I saw when I tested the Archer AX50. There are now 5 main tabs at the top, the first showing the network map, followed by the internet section and the wireless area where you can quickly configure some of the basic settings. The fourth is the Home Shield, which just tries to persuade you to use the app. And next is the advanced section where you can properly configure the router. Under network, you get to set up your network connection far more in depth, while under LAN it is possible to link aggregate 2 LAN ports. Under wireless you get a healthy amount of settings, which even if not on the same level of the professional options offered by ASUS, they should be enough for most users. There are also some settings for USB storage, NAT forwarding, some security related settings, and some VPN options. We're not done because there is another feature that I have not seen on many other routers. And yes, I am talking about the support for Easy Mesh. Does that mean that TP-Link will allow devices from other brands to work with one mesh routers as long as there's support for easy mesh? In theory it should, but so far a lot of users have complained that the easy mesh simply replaces one mesh without the benefit of the inter-brand compatibility. Also know that there are some older one mesh routers that will not connect to easy mesh TP-Link routers. So yeah. Still, I do look forward to the day when I can create a mesh network with TP-Link, Netgear and Asus routers. It's just not today. It's a bit of a shame that TP-Link moved away from the home care package and went with a subscription-based only model with a home shield. And I'm still concerned that the manufacturer walks the same road as Netgear. After testing the Archer AX73, which is one of the first models without home care, I can't really give a definitive conclusion on where TP-Link is headed. But I can say that the router does not have its vital features completely plucked out, while forcing you to use the home shield to get them back. It's clearly not on the same level of care as Asus, which adds new features that simplify the way the user interacts with the network, but the AX73 software should be enough for most users, especially in terms of features and control. The wireless performance was decent, being very similar to how the RT-AX80U performed, so overall it's a okay Wi-Fi router which could be a good alternative to the more expensive options out there. That's about it for now. Thank you for watching and see you next time.